April the 25th, 1915, men of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps landed at Gallipoli. It was on that day the traditions of our fighting forces were born. These stories of their sons and daughters at war we proudly dedicate to the memory of Anzac.
The Arab lands of Syria and Lebanon were French-mandated territory. It was a country of tangled mountains, of wide desert stretches, of fertile plains, a country rich in history, the land of the ancient Phoenicians, of the storied cities of Tyre and Sidon and Damascus. Here, the 7th Australian Division was destined to receive its baptism of fire. The French had a strong gather. They owed allegiance to Vichy and were consequently ill-disposed to Britain. Uncertain and dangerous neighbors for the British, fighting desperately to hold the Middle East. When the Iraq Revolt broke out in May 1941, German and Italian aircraft used Syria as a stepping stone to intervene on the side of the rebels. By mid-1941, a three-pronged threat had developed in the Middle East. Rommel and his Africa Corps had landed at Tripoli and thrust towards Cairo and the Suez Canal, leaving Tobruk as a thorn in his side. Another German army seized Yugoslavia, engulfed Greece, and parachuted into Crete. The third threat was in Vichy French Syria. It was known that Germans had infiltrated Syria, and Winston Churchill thought it essential to occupy Syria and forestall another threat to the Suez Canal. It was Hitler's decision to invade Russia which turned German eyes from the Mediterranean. To this great and doomed enterprise, everything else had to take second place. Greece and Crete cost the German army heavy losses, and more important, they cost Hitler time. The idea of an occupation of Syria and thrusts towards India and Egypt was tempting. But now there was neither time nor troops available for it. When the British decided that Syria must be occupied, Germany was in no position to intervene. By the end of June, the German armies had struck into Russia to begin a campaign which was to bleed them dry. De Gaulle did not know whether the French would fight for Syria. From his headquarters in Beirut, the French commander ordered strong forces to the frontier. The invading force was split into three parts, each of about brigade strength. The left prong along the coast to Beirut, a center prong towards Mejeun and Jazin, and the right prong to come into the east, capture Damascus and push on to Beirut. This third prong was British, Indian and Free French. The left and center prongs were formed of Australians of the untried 7th Division. The attacking force had only 2 brigades of the 7th Division, plus 2 battalions of the 6th Division, and some British, Indian and Free French troops. 9 good battalions against 18 battalions of tough French regulars. On June the 8th, Victorians, West Australians and South Australians of the 21st Brigade struck into Lebanon along the coast. In the central thrust, Mejeun was captured by the 25th Australian Brigade. Men of the 2nd Pioneer Battalion kept a watch on the skies as they worked to build a fort for the Bren carriers of the 9th Australian Divisional Cavalry. Car of a famous British regiment, the Royals, scouts cautiously towards the enemy. Meanwhile, on the coast, the French had blown a huge crater in the road. Men of the 2nd 6th Australian Field Company, led by a Victorian Shire engineer, Lieutenant Harper, worked feverishly to clear the way. Roads were cleared, the infantry pushed on. But to hold up the Australian advance, the French had demolished the bridges over the Litani River. The swift-flowing Litani was a serious obstacle. Engineers overcame it by laying a bridge across in record time. There was reason for haste. The French were bringing up reinforcements and strengthening their positions. With bridges in position, Queensland infantry of the 2nd 31st Battalion pressed ahead. There were French troops fighting on both sides in this strange and bitter war. These Free Frenchmen, who'd rallied to General de Gaulle, took part in the thrust towards Damascus. Some of them had deserted the Vichy garrison in Syria to join the Free French and were now fighting against old comrades in arms. Among the Free French were 3 battalions of Senegalese mercenaries. Everywhere as the Australians advanced, they came up against country which favored the defenders. In this mountainous terrain, the French regular soldiers, fighting with skill and determination, had all the advantages. New South Welshmen of the 2nd 3rd Infantry Battalion of the 6th Division, who'd fought in the Western Desert and Greece, and men of the 2nd 3rd Australian Machine Gun Battalion played a gallant part beside the Free French and Indian troops in the bitter fighting which led to the capture of Damascus. The work of the Australian Provo Corps, military police, was not always appreciated by the troops when they were on leave. But in action, in Syria, as in the Western Desert and Greece, the Provos earned respect by their courage and devotion to duty. In a campaign like that in Syria, the MP's task was complicated by civilian refugees who might easily be enemy agents or carrying concealed weapons. Of the 2nd 6th Australian Field Regiment opened the way for an attack in the Majeyoun sector. Lieutenant John Hutton of Victoria gives fire orders. French officer attached to the Australians went forward to call on his countrymen in Fort Kiam to surrender. Behind him, troops of Colonel Monaghan, 2nd 33rd Battalion moved up. The defenders refused to surrender. This company, commanded by Captain Tom Cotton of West Australia, prepared to attack. The French resisted stoutly for a time, but when the final Australian attack went in, they abandoned the fort. Lieutenant Connor of Roseville, New South Wales, who earlier had heroically seized and held a bastion of the fort until lack of ammunition forced him to withdraw, now directed a search for any lurking enemies, but the defenders had gone. On the coast, Australian guns were in action against tanks. Men of Brigadier Jack Stevens' 21st Brigade had suffered heavily in their fighting advance of the coastal plain of Lebanon. They had forced a crossing of the Litani River, beaten the famous French Foreign Legion, fought off French tanks. Now they were clearing the way for an attack on a key objective, the ancient Phoenician city of Sidon. Sidon, with its Crusaders' castle jutting out into the Mediterranean, was by far the biggest town they had yet seen. On June 15th, Lieutenant Harper led a platoon of West Australians of the 2nd 16th Battalion into Sidon. The rest of the battalion soon followed. General Maitland Wilson, British commander in Palestine, who planned the invasion of Syria, visited Sidon. The Australians welcomed him with a guard of honor. This ancient fort was built by the Crusaders, who centuries before had fought on this same coast. After the capture of Sidon, there was a lull on the coastal sector because vigorous French counterattacks were holding up progress inland. The weary infantrymen of the 21st Brigade welcomed the chance to take it easy. Captured French guns were dragged out from their skillfully sighted and deeply dug-in positions. For this, the Australians used captured French gun tractors. This was the French 75mm field gun, made famous in World War I and still a viciously effective weapon. The Australians, who were short of equipment, used French guns and tanks against their former owners. The Australians rested when and while they could. They knew that hard fighting still lay ahead and that the French resistance was far from broken. Already troops were moving into position for new, and it was hoped, decisive battles. 40 countrymen of the 6th Australian Cavalry were mounted on captured French horses to patrol the rugged hills of the anti-Lebanon. Inevitably, they were known to their comrades as the Kelly Gang. More French guns were captured. The French were far stronger in artillery than our forces, but the Australian gunners of the 2nd, 4th, 5th, 6th and 9th Field Regiments outfought them. was in Syria that an Australian gunner officer, Lieutenant A.R. Cutler, now Australian High Commissioner in Pakistan, won the first and only Victoria Cross awarded to an Australian artilleryman in either World War. It was in Syria, too, that gunners of the 2nd, 4th fought and won a duel with a Vichy warship. But the Vichy French fought on, even though the Allied column struck deep into Syria, heading for Aleppo, Palmyra, Damascus, and Beirut. By July 6th, the main French forces were driven back into the rugged mountains of Lebanon. These held up our forces closing in on Beirut from Damascus and Jazid. Our main attack was on the coast, with encircling desert hooks from the inland forces. And now only the fortifications along the Damour River stood between the Australians and Beirut, the French headquarters. If we could force the Damour River, we could probably force surrender. The attack on Damour was planned as a combined operation by General Tubby Allen, commanding the 7th Division. The general orders an air attack. At headquarters of No. 3 Squadron, RAAF, Captain Alan Binney, Air Liaison Officer, takes the message. Squadron Leader Peter Jeffrey of Sydney commands No. 3 Australian Squadron, whose job is to give close support to the ground forces, to protect the naval forces bombarding the coast, and to attack airfields, ports, and oil tanks. Jeffrey briefs his pilots. Hard-working, often unsung, ground crew prepare the squadron's Tomahawk fighters. The Syrian campaign was the first occasion on which No. 3 was equipped with Tomahawks. They gave a good account of themselves. Their camp in Syria was among familiar gum trees introduced from Australia after the First World War. On June the 14th, 8 Tomahawks, led by Jeffrey, shot down 3 out of 8 German Junker 88s attacking Australian warships off the Syrian coast. Alan Rawlinson of Victoria, later to command No. 3 Squadron, climbs into his cockpit. Of No. 3 Squadron fly in formation on their way to carry out the mission ordered by General Allen. There were also 2 Royal Air Force squadrons of Blenheim bombers fighting in Syria. Air support available to General Laverack amounted only to 2 fighter and 2 bomber squadrons and 1 Army Cooperation Squadron. 70 first-line aircraft against 100 French. Blenheim's objective was French headquarters, Beirut, the white building just below the racecourse. Bang on. The next target was the B Damour. Naval forces joined shore artillery to bombard Damour. The Australian cruiser, Perth, and Australian destroyers played their parts in softening up Damour. The 21st Brigade, together with the 6th Division battalions, now concentrated for the assault on Damour. General Allen, himself a Gallipoli veteran, compared the terrain with Gallipoli. They faced, these young volunteers from every state in the Commonwealth, a fearful test of courage and endurance. They had to scramble over a precipitous ravine and a river in the teeth of heavy fire from a determined and well-entrenched enemy, including the famous fighting men of the Foreign Legion. The naval bombardment continued. The Aussies pressed forward, but the rugged country favored the French defenders. Now they moved in for the final attack. The deep gorge in the river behind them, the enemy trenches ahead. The French fought with a fury of despair until they saw the Australian bayonets. Then, at last, they broke and fled. The shell-battered town of Namur was in Australian hands. More important, the backbone of French resistance was broken, and the way to Beirut lay open. General Dent's, French High Commissioner and Commander-in-Chief, pressed for peace. At midnight on July the 11th, a ceasefire was ordered, and the guns fell silent from Damascus to the sea. General de Vedilac, Dent's deputy, came to Akka to sign the armistice on July the 14th. The victors, General Maitland Wilson, Air Commodore Dolbeac, and General Laverack. The armistice agreement provided for the occupation of Syria and Lebanon by Allied forces and the grant of full honors of war to the French forces, who were allowed to retain their individual weapons. The 18,000 Australians who had borne the brunt of the campaign at a cost of 1,600 casualties welcomed its end with relief. Some units were in such rough country that their victory beer issue had to be carried up to them on muleback. They've earned a drink. In Beirut, Lebanese and Syrians, smarting under French rule, welcomed the Australians as deliverers. To the 6th Australian Cavalry and West Australians of the 2nd 16th Battalion fell the honour of the first entry into Beirut, the goal they had fought so hard to win. Lebanon is predominantly a Christian country, and patriarchs of the Syrian Orthodox Church came to greet the victors. General Catrou was de Gaulle's deputy in the Middle East and commander of the Free French forces there. The dignitaries of the Syrian Orthodox Church were greeted by General Maitland Wilson. With General Wilson was Australia's General Laverack, who commanded the Australian, British, Indian, and Free French troops in Syria. This was victory. In Beirut Central Square, an Australian band led the celebrations. To the Lebanese and Syrians, the Australian victory offered hope of the political independence they were ultimately to achieve, and the Australians were treated with cheerful friendliness. After the grueling campaign, it was good to be feted instead of shot at. Other Australians of the 2nd 5th Battalion were ordered north to the Turkish frontier, along roads and through a countryside where much history had been made. They paid tribute to an earlier generation of the Australian fighting men who had helped to found the Anzac tradition, which the young soldiers of the 7th Division had so gallantly upheld. There was sightseeing in the famous Baalbek ruins. On the Turkish frontier, the Australians fraternized with Turkish soldiers whose fathers had fought their fathers on Gallipoli 26 years before. Damascus, Marjayoun, Litani River, Timor. These proud battle honors now belonged to Australia's history. The men who won them had added a new and splendid luster to the record of the AIF.